This is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety's Disaster Discussions podcast, where we explore the intersection of weather and the built environment.
Welcome to the Disaster Discussions podcast, where we explore the intersection of weather and the built environment. I'm your host, Rachel Penton-Goche. There are events in American history that mark distinctive before and after periods. For the Gulf Coast, August 29th, 2005 is one of those historical markers, the before and after of Hurricane Katrina. Katrina was the deadliest U.S. storm in more than 75 years, taking more than 1,300 lives and the costliest tropical cyclone on record for the United States. NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, in consultation with the National Hurricane Center, estimate Katrina's losses at more than $200 billion based on 2024 Consumer Price Index adjusted costs. In total, 1 million housing units in the Gulf Coast region were damaged or destroyed, including 70% of all occupied units in New Orleans. Tens of thousands of jobs were lost due to severely damaged or destroyed businesses and supporting infrastructure, with damage to major highways in and around the city bringing commerce to a standstill. Hurricane Katrina fundamentally changed the way of life for people in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama through devastating wind, record storm surge, and the failure of levee systems. 20 years later, Katrina's scar can still be felt in these locations, and though they've been rebuilt, Katrina is anything but a distant memory. Joining me on the podcast today to discuss this anniversary and how life has changed on the Gulf Coast is renowned Stormchaser Josh Morgerman, also known as iCyclone. Welcome to Disaster Discussions, Josh.
Thanks, Rachel. Great to be with you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you. And as we'll get to a little later in the podcast, you actually live in this area of the country. So we are going to be talking about that. And we're going to be talking a lot about hurricanes. But I want to start with a little bit about your background. So you told me you grew up in New York, you studied history at Harvard, and somehow eventually found yourself inside dozens of hurricanes. So you are a storm chaser, a hurricane chaser. Tell me about yourself and how did you get into storm chasing? How did you go from history at Harvard to being inside the eye of hurricanes around the world?
Yeah, people are always really puzzled. Like my the pieces of my past don't add up. They don't make sense. I was born in New York City, grew up mostly just outside of the city on Long Island, and I was a born weather nerd. As far back as I could remember, even when I was a toddler, I just noticed, or I just remember getting very excited about violent weather, lightning, thunder, the wind blowing, the house shaking. It was like a drug for me as a kid. And I think with a lot of professional storm chasers, that's how it is. This is not it's not an interest that you just take up at some point in your life. It is something in your blood that you're born with. So I always had it. I was a weather nerd, a hardcore weather nerd as a teenager, and I wanted to study meteorology. And I had the kind of parents that were very involved in all aspects of my life, including, where I would apply to school, where I would go to school, and what I would study. And my father's like, "You're going to get a liberal arts education." He's like, "You're not going to do this. You're not going to do the sciences." So, which is interesting because my father was an engineer, so he came more from a science and math background, but he perceived me as more of a man of letters, an artistic type, and he felt that it would be best for me to get a liberal arts education. So he made that decision. But here's the crazy thing. I think he was right. I'm not a meteorologist, and actually I don't think I was cut out to be. But although I play a role in the scientific community, and I think we might talk about that later, as a field data sort of collector, I actually, my role in the sort of world of hurricanes is actually turned out just right in a sense.
Yeah, I can just kind of looking at a little bit of what you do. Obviously, you've been in lots of TV programs, as we'll get to, and you do a lot of work on social media and online. So really, kind of a meshing of that, that art, that science storytelling, which is certainly an art form, combined with your background as a storm chaser. So that is definitely an interesting story. So I have to ask you, how did you come up with the name? What does the name iCyclone mean? Where does that come from? How did you come up with that?
I came up with the name 20 years ago, and honestly, it didn't mean really a whole lot. I just wanted a social media handle that was compact and sort of easy to spell, and that sort of captured the sum total of what I do. And at the time, that sort of branding was trendy, like iPad, iPod, iTunes. And I just figured, okay, I'm going to sort of, but my brand is going to live largely online and in digital channels. So that just seemed like a cool way to go. Looking back, I don't know if it's an ideal brand name for me, but that's what it is. And there's so much kind of equity in the brand now that it's not gonna change. So iCyclone is my handle across all social media and YouTube and everything else, and it works fine.
Yeah, well, you certainly have lived large. You've actually penetrated the core of 81 hurricanes now. I want to talk a little bit about your storm chasing. First, let's take it back to the beginning. I mean, I know you grew up with storms on the coast there in New York, but what was the first hurricane that you set out to chase, and what was that like?
Yeah, so I grew up on Long Island, and so we get hurricanes on occasion up there. They're not the kind that you get down on the Gulf Coast, the big nasty kind that you get over the warm water. Well, they can be, but they're not. They don't get quite as intense as Gulf Coast hurricanes. But that was all I knew. So there were a couple when I was a kid, and they really sparked curiosity. I was just, I remember waking up the next morning after one of them and just being shocked at how the town looked, the mess, and being really curious about it. And then the next one happened when I was a teenager, and that was really exciting because it was Gloria, came right up the coast, and the eye passed right over my town. I couldn't believe my good fortune, although it was destructive. But the first chase I did was Hurricane Bob, which hit New England in 1991. Now, what folks have to remember is this was before the internet. This was before the movie Twister. So I did not know there was such a thing as storm chasing. I didn't know that there was a term for that. I didn't know it was a thing. I'd never read about it. I'd never heard about it. I was doing an internship in Washington, D.C. over the summer. The hurricane was going up the coast, and I just thought, wow, I want to be in it. I was too young to rent a car or anything, so I chased the hurricane on a train. So I took a train up to New York City. And then I got another train along the Connecticut coast toward Rhode Island as the hurricane was hitting, trees falling across the tracks and everything else. And so that was my first chase in New England with a paper map and pencils, no mobile phone, no nothing, and a train.
Hey, it sounds like you may have invented storm chasing with paper and pencil.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is before mobile data, before, people don't realize this was back before the internet, mobile data, mobile phones, radar. Literally, it was just paper maps, pencils, calling into the National Hurricane Center to get the latest position. I know this sounds prehistoric for probably some of the people listening to this.
Okay, so at what point did you was there like a before and after period where you kind of considered yourself, okay, I'm officially a storm chaser now, I'm going to chase these storms? Like what storm came next? What was kind of that turning point? Or did you just find yourself in more and more storms until you were suddenly a storm chaser? How did that come about?
It's a great question. So I chased a couple of storms in the 90s. Then I started a business, a branding and advertising agency and in LA in the late 90s. And then that took me to Europe. I was actually living in Eastern Europe, in Prague, for the early to mid 2000s. Our company was headquartered there, and we sort of were specialized in providing branding and marketing consultation to Eastern European corporate clients who were looking for kind of American know-how in terms of like that type of stuff. So I was living over there and kind of disconnected from my weather nerd self. And this was during the very, very busy 2004, 2005 seasons. So I was on the sidelines, just kind of watching all of it from afar. Finally, late in the 2005 season, in October, I came home to visit my parents in New York. And that was when Wilma formed in the Caribbean. And I hadn't chased in a few years. And I kind of came out of retirement. I hunted Wilma in Florida, which was a strong Category 3. It was a scary chase. As I was in Everglades City, the town started to go underwater. The wind was ripping. I got freaked out by it, but I got this feeling of like this rush from it. And at that point, I said, "This is my calling. This is what I need to be doing, and I'm gonna I'm doing this for real." And that was really when I officially was like, "I'm dedicating my life to this." It was after Wilma.
We can't stop wildfire, but there is a pathway to better protect your home. I'm Steve Hawk, Senior Director for Wildfire at IBHS. If you live in areas at risk of wildfire, consider building or retrofitting your home using our Wildfire Prepared Home Standard. It addresses ways you can make your home more resilient to wildfire by creating a 5-foot non-combustible zone and preparing your home's exterior to help break the pathways of fire spread. Visit wildfireprepared.org to learn how to protect your home and apply for a wildfire prepared home designation.
So you've gone on to chase many more storms. Again, we mentioned you do hold the record for going inside 81 hurricanes. So I have to ask, are you in the Guinness Book of World Records? Like, who keeps track of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So other chasers and I, like the top guys who do this, and I say guys because, I shouldn't sort of say that casually. It's been mostly a men's sport up to now, although it's changing. There are more and more, I've noticed since the time I started doing this to now that now a lot more women are sort of are kind of jumping into this. But the top people who do it, we keep track. I noticed, I was chasing so many storms and hunting them down, and I'm just going to fully admit I'm a very competitive guy. I'm very competitive. I think again, it was probably my how my dad raised me. He pushed me really hard in sports, and I do view storm chasing as a competitive sport. And since I have been in more storms than anyone else, I do like to kind of keep track of that. So basically, the other storm chasers and I, we kind of adhere to a standard where we consider it a successful chase, meaning you got in the storm if you get in the eye wall, which is the core of intense wind. Usually that's a very cut and dried thing. There's a case, sometimes there are borderline cases where, okay, maybe I'm just on the edge, but generally it's the easiest way to define whether you were in the storm or not. So that's how the guys who keep track of this and who are really prolific, this is how we count it. How many eye walls did I get in? And the Guinness Book of Records, they have not sort of started following this as a metric, but we all do. And in terms of worldwide conquests, I'm the top guy at 81 right now.
Yeah, and you've been all around the world, not just chasing storms in the United States. So tell me about some of those memorable places that you've been, some memorable chases. I imagine there's some challenges and some logistics and just a lot of differences between, being in the United States on home turf and being in one of these countries, whether they're calling it a typhoon or a cyclone or whatever the terminology is in that part of the world. So any particular storms or countries or anything like that, any stories that you want to talk about?
Oh, yeah, this is a big topic in itself. You're right. I do chase all around the world. And in fact, most of my chasing is outside of the United States. Only about a third of my hunting is in the US. Most of it is abroad. And yes, the experience of a hurricane is so completely different in other countries. As you pointed out, what we call a hurricane has other names in other parts of the world. Like you said, typhoon or cyclone down in Australia. For some reason, there's just no standardized word for this thing. But it's very different. One of the things that most surprises Americans when they hear about my experiences abroad is that storm surge in a lot of areas is not an issue. We have the unfortunate distinction in the United States. Our Gulf Coast, we have that very shallow offshore water because we have that very sort of gentle continental slope. Like one of the things the slope of the continental shelf is gentle. One of the things I noticed when I moved down here. So I grew up in a beach town on Long Island in New York. When I would go to the beach as a kid, you go 20 feet out from the shore and you're in deep water. Okay, here in Mississippi, you walk a mile out and it's up to your knees. It's like you can't get in the water. It's so shallow. That shallow water is why we get these tremendous storm surges. The shallow water offshore augments the storm surge. The U.S. Gulf Coast is just one of the most uniquely vulnerable places on the planet. It is just designed to make these turbocharged storm surges. In other countries, it is not that way. Parts of the west coast of Mexico, parts of Taiwan and Japan, you could be in a category 4, a block from the coast, and you don't have to worry about storm surge. The water doesn't really come up. You might get some big waves and stuff, but it's just not even an issue. So that's one thing. The other part of the earth that is like us, that is actually even worse than us in terms of this, Bangladesh, which has had the deadliest tropical cyclones on record. They've had tropical cyclones like, what we call a hurricane that have killed hundreds of thousands of people because they have that same kind of shallow water offshore. So there's that. But in those other places like in Taiwan and Japan, you have to worry about rock slides and landslides because where their hurricanes or their typhoons come in everything's very, it's more mountainous, more hilly. So there's different challenges. Here in the US where we get hurricanes, it's all flat. We don't get rock slides during hurricanes generally. So there's stuff like that. And there's also the cultural differences, the cultural barriers. I don't speak, Japanese or Chinese too well. So those are challenges when chasing in those places. It's a different experience everywhere.
Yeah, certainly an interesting experience. I guess is there a situation that was, scary or dangerous or logistically challenging that sticks out with any particular storm in one of these other countries?
I would say the one that really, there's two that are really burned into my memory. One is Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, which was the equivalent of a high-end Category 5 hurricane for us. I was in a fairly large city, a couple 100,000 people, called Tacloban City, and it got the inner core of the typhoon. It passed right over the city. A storm surge swept the entire city. This is a part of East Asia that does get storm surge. A big storm surge swept the city, and they don't know how many died, but it was probably between 15 and 25,000 people. And at the height of that storm, I was in the highest part of the city, and even we went underwater. And at the height of the storm, I had to throw my camera down and jump into the water to pull people out because our hotel went underwater, and people on the lowest floor were going to drown. So I just threw down the camera and became basically a rescuer during that one. That was a storm where I was so rattled by the human impact that I kind of didn't want to chase for a while after it. Just coming out of the hotel afterward, dead bodies in the street. I was like, I have this sort of unending fascination with the meteorological side, and that was one where the human impact, like I couldn't process it, and I for a while I was just like, all right, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to see that ever again. I kind of worked through it. But that one really, it shocked me. And because of that, I've actually been back there several times since. I've gone back to Tacloban City. I went back 3 months later to do research. I went back a year later to commemorate the 1 year anniversary. And I went back 10 years later. I kept a connection with the place, with the people there. And that's kind of helped me actually work through it. Just kind of trying to be part of the recovery, trying to be helpful in various ways, whether it was fundraising for victims and stuff like that, and also going back to kind of celebrate their rebirth. That's kind of, given me some kind of, helped me make meaning out of that experience.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the most stark differences between the U.S. and some of these other countries. We've kind of come to take it for granted. Our buildings are designed for life safety, but in some of these other countries, like you said, tens of thousands of people are still to this day killed in some of these tropical cyclones. So some of your work, I want to talk about a couple of things. You have been featured in several TV shows related to your chasing. I want to talk about that, and then some of the data that you collect on these chases. It is used by scientists. So tell me about both of those aspects of your chasing.
Yeah, the data collection is what really excites me and motivates me now. I've evolved over the years. I think that when I started chasing, when I did those first few chases, it was all about just wanting to be in the experience and feel the storm. And it was like the rush of it. It was all about the experience in the moment. And in fact, in those really early chases, not only did I not bring meteorological devices for measuring them, I didn't even bring a camera. It wasn't important to me to even record it. It was literally just about being in the moment. But then I realized, well, these are really, incredible experiences. And I do want to sort of, commemorate them in some way. But the data collection, I started collecting data about 15 years ago. And the reason was I was chasing all over the world. And what I realized is, a lot of these hurricanes that when they're coming ashore in remote areas, especially in developing nations, they might come ashore with almost no measurements, no surface observations. These are parts of the world where they don't have recon aircraft flying into them to measure them. There might not be weather stations for hundreds of miles around. So our entire knowledge of some of these events is just based on satellite intensity estimates, which are, by the way, not very precise. And I realized if I'm going to be there on the ground in these things, right in the heart of them, God, I might as well measure them because I could really bring value here. So I started bringing in portable devices to measure these storms. And I got very good at collecting data and doing it properly calibrating the instruments, properly deploying them to make sure that the data are high quality, they're not contaminated. I really just paid a lot of attention to this on collecting scientifically meaningful, clean, good data. in the jaws of these beasts in really remote places in Mexico and the Philippines and everything and everywhere else. So scientists use these data, like the National Hurricane Center very often uses and cites my data in their post-analysis and their reports, especially for hurricanes, for example, in Mexico, where they might not have many observations. A lot of times the pressure that I measure in the eye is the only pressure reading they have from the eye at landfall, which then helps them kind of estimate the intensity. And also things like, what time did the hurricane come ashore exactly? And exactly where did it come ashore? I deploy multiple devices. And when you take the sum total of my data on an individual expedition, you get a lot of clues about not only the intensity of the storm, but the structure and how large it was and where it came ashore and everything else. So as I say, I'm not a scientist. I was a history concentrator at school, but I'm the scientist hunting dog.
Yeah, it's certainly crucial, incredibly valuable data that you're collecting. Here in the U.S., storm chasers, I'm kind of thinking tornadoes, but obviously, storm chasers are often the first on the ground. That ground truth telling us when a tornado has touched down in the Great Plains and places like that. So that's awesome that you're able to do this for tropical cyclones and some of these other countries. So some of these kind of chases, either you've documented them, or others have kind of documented them with you and in the form of some of these TV shows. So if people kind of want to watch some of these chases or see you, get to know more about you, where can they watch some of these shows that you've appeared on?
Yeah, I've starred in a couple of reality series. The first one was actually a British series. It was a BBC UK TV production called Hurricane Man. A British producer came to me and he said, "Hey, we want to make a show, about you." And basically the concept was a British film crew follows me around the world for a year as I hunt down, typhoons and hurricanes all around the world. So that was called Hurricane Man. Very cool show. I have to be honest, I was very concerned. I signed my contract. I flew to London and I met the crew, and it was, these, very polite kind of, Brits who really never been in any kind of crazy weather, we don't realize in North America, or maybe some of us do, but North America is an extremely violent continent weather-wise. Like, we get everything here. Other places they don't get the weather we do. So, and that includes like the United Kingdom. They don't really get crazy weather. So I was really concerned. I'm like, oh God, these people they're not going to hold up, but they did. They were total warriors. They all came into Michael's eye with me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, these Brits who've never been in hurricanes went into a Category 5 hurricane, and they filmed it, and they were warriors. I was actually really impressed. So there's that series, and then I did in the United States, I did one called Mission Hurricane. Again, another series I started in which I look back at sort of my greatest conquests and sort of tell the tales and bring the viewer back into those experiences with me. They're both on various streaming platforms, and you could find them. Like, it depends sort of what platform you're on. But Hurricane Man is one, and Mission Hurricane is the other. They're both great series.
Awesome. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about what you're up to these days, which of course still includes plenty of chasing, but we're going to tease ahead, I guess. We're going to talk about your house down on the Mississippi coast in a little bit as well. First, I want to talk a little bit more about Hurricane Katrina and just kind of going back to the beginning, reminding folks of how the storm came about. So we first saw Katrina make landfall as a Category 1 hurricane near Miami on August 25th, and then re-entered the Gulf the next day, turned to the northwest and then to the north, making a beeline for the mouth of the Mississippi River. Katrina made landfall early in the morning around 6 a.m. on August 29th on the Louisiana coast as a Category 3 storm. Max sustained winds of 125 miles per hour and minimum central pressure of 920 millibars. At the time, that was the lowest pressure on record for a Category 3 landfall, or I should say at the time, it was the third lowest on record for any landfalling U.S. hurricane. Still one of the strongest Category 3 storms, though, on record. It made a second landfall a few hours later, just before 10 a.m. in Hancock County, Mississippi. That's near the Louisiana-Mississippi border. Still had winds of 120 miles per hour before it began to move inland. So we talked a little bit about you chasing Wilma later on in 2005. So I guess you were still in Europe at this point when Katrina came ashore. Were you watching it from afar and kind of seeing what was going on with Katrina?
Absolutely. I was watching Katrina from Prague in the Czech Republic. That's where I was living. And this was, I can't believe looking back at that era in my life when chasing was not, I wasn't putting it first. But yes, I remember watching Katrina from afar. And of course, just, with just shocked astonishment, just this category 5 approaching Metro New Orleans. It was just like the worst possible, scenario you can imagine. And although it weakened before landfall, it didn't seem to matter too much because the impact on this part of the coast, whatever the official category of the storm, this was a cataclysmic impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a high school student in Mobile, Alabama at the time, and even over in Mobile, which was quite far removed from the eye of the storm and some of those biggest impacts. In Mobile County, we lost power for 3 days. I was out of school for 1 or 2 weeks. Downtown Mobile was underwater. For Mobile, this was an infamous event because if you're familiar with the barrier island of Dauphin Island down on the coast, it was sliced in half by Katrina, and as that water came ashore and really made a big cut in the island. There was an oil rig that broke free, floated into Mobile Bay. We had winds of about 80 to 90 miles per hour. I lived out near the Mobile Regional Airport at the time. So for me, it was fun because as a young person, we got to spend the night in the dining room because that was the centralmost room in the house. Had no windows, had no doors. We got to bring, snacks and air mattresses. So we had our little hurricane party going on. But of course, it was a serious situation. I also had some family members staying with me who lived in Waveland, Mississippi at the time, which of course was really, ground zero, some of the worst devastation. Yeah, they stayed with us. They took cover from the storm, and as soon as the storm passed and they were able to get out, they went back to Waveland. And unfortunately, they lived about 2 miles or so inland from the coast. Unfortunately, their home was a total loss. So certainly a memorable event from my standpoint, even being over in Mobile. But I want to talk about some of the lead up to this storm. It was a well predicted storm. The National Hurricane Center predicted that the central Gulf Coast, including the city of New Orleans, would be directly affected by Katrina as a major hurricane. And they predicted this about 56 hours before landfall. There was a mandatory evacuation for the entire city of New Orleans. And to my knowledge, this was the first time ever that a mandatory evacuation was issued for New Orleans at the time. And I think one of the factors that really went into this, and you as a chaser will recognize this instantly, but a lot of us in the meteorology world are familiar with that really powerful language that the National Weather Service meteorologists used in the forecast discussion. So just want to read a little excerpt from that one of those forecast discussions. It said, Hurricane Katrina, most powerful hurricane with unprecedented strength, rivaling the intensity of Hurricane Camille of 1969. Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. At least one half of well-constructed homes will have roof and wall failure. All gabled roofs will fail, leaving those homes severely damaged or destroyed. Power outages will last for weeks. Water shortages will make human suffering incredible by modern standards. So Josh, you now live in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, when you're not chasing. And of course, this was impacted not only by Katrina, but as we heard in that forecast discussion excerpt, Camille was really the benchmark storm for this area. So I imagine that A, you can relate to that powerful wording in the forecast discussion, but B, that you've also heard some of these stories. So talk about kind of some of the stories you've heard about prior to Katrina. What was coastal Mississippi's perception of Camille up until this point?
Yeah, I joke that, in Bay St. Louis and coastal Mississippi, there's like 3 important dates. There's like the birth of Christ, Camille, and Katrina. And when you go around Bay St. Louis, when you look at placards and it's a very historical town, which is one of the things I love about it. I'm a history guy, and I love a lot of the town is still here, thank God. But they all talk about 1969 Hurricane Camille and 2005 Katrina. These were 2 completely transformative events for this region. Now, up until Katrina, of course, it was Camille. And I remember even as a weather nerd growing up in New York, Camille was like, when I was, young, that was the American hurricane. That was, everything was Camille. Camille, by every yardstick, was the greatest hurricane. Technically, it was number 2 below the 1935 Labor Day storm in Florida. But in terms of a hurricane plowing into the mainland U.S., that was like, Camille was like everything. And so that had its own legendary status. And of course, it did for Mississippians. And folks who wrote it out here. And what's so shocking is that Katrina did eclipse it. I'm very into the history, and I do, whenever I meet an older person here who is old enough to remember Camille, I like to interview them about Camille. I want to get as much Camille history recorded while people who went through it and remembered are still living. And but what's so interesting with all of them is that they thought they'd been in the ultimate storm, and then Katrina just kind of blasted it away. Now, they were very different hurricanes. Camille, in terms of wind, was absolutely much, much stronger than Katrina. Camille was a violent hurricane. It was smaller, much more intense. The wind, and people who went through Camille said the wind was way scarier in that one. People in Bay St. Louis, past Christiane, in that inner core, those were some crazy winds, estimated to be 175 miles an hour by the National Hurricane Center. That's the official sort of estimated landfall. Katrina's winds didn't hold a candle to Camille, but the storm surge was extremely high. What folks need to realize, and I think some folks don't, is that storm surge and winds are not, there's a sort of a rough relationship. Stronger the winds, generally the higher the storm surge, but there's other factors. Katrina's storm surge was the highest on record, not just in the United States, but the Western Hemisphere. And that peak storm surge happened on the Mississippi coast. So this was an absolutely, literally a cataclysmic event. And this area, this populated coast, bore the brunt of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Katrina really, the storm affected areas, of course, from southeast Louisiana eastward to Mobile Bay, Mississippi coast, of course, in between there. So we saw that surge 25 to 28 feet above normal tide level around Waveland, Bay St. Louis, and past Christiane. That's where some of that highest surge was, even over to Biloxi and Gulfport, 20 to 22 foot surge. And across the Louisiana coast, around 10 to 20, and over in Mobile County, near Bayou La Batterie, about 12 to 14 feet. One of the notable things, though, the surge penetrated 6 miles inland across most of southern Mississippi and up to 12 miles inland along bays and rivers. Of course, Lake Pontchartrain experienced a huge storm surge as well, as some of that water pushed into the lake. And then, of course, we began to see the problem when that water pushed into that network of canals and channels in and around New Orleans. Floodwaters overtopped and breached several levees around New Orleans beginning the morning of August 29th. And New Orleans ended up with about 80% of the city in floodwaters of 15 to 20 feet. Some of those areas, of course, we saw play out on national news. The lower Ninth Ward, New Orleans East, taking a lot of that flood water. It ended up taking 6 weeks to remove all the water from the city. And of course, we later learned that many of those levees failed below design water levels due to some engineering falls. So really the storm, it caused severe wind damage, brought rain, tornadoes, all the usual things. But the most tragic part is that storm surge. So tell me about where your house stands now, and would it have been underwater during Katrina, and by how much?
It's a great question. So after living part-time in Bay St. Louis for a couple of years, renting a cottage, I decided I loved the town so much I wanted to put down roots here and that I wanted to build a home. So when it came time to find land, one of the most important topics on my mind was the elevation and sort of what it had seen in past storms. So I'm in Old Town Bay St. Louis. I'm in the neighborhood between the tracks and the Gulf, about a block from the Gulf, and you can see it right there from my front lawn. So it's kind of living on the edge a little bit. Maybe that's part of my storm chaser mindset, just wanting to kind of have a feeling of danger. This neighborhood, I'm at my ground level is 19 feet, which for coastal Mississippi is pretty good. That's fairly high. So I've talked to the older residents, and I've also looked at FEMA maps. And basically, in the two cataclysms here, Camille and Katrina. So Camille, it looks like there was maybe about a foot of water on the ground on my block. Katrina basically wiped the block out, except for the little house next to mine, a little cinder block house. Every house on my block now is new, was built after Katrina. So Camille was the second highest storm surge in American history, and the block was basically fine. So what that told me is basically where I am is it's fine for everything except a 500-year event. I did some statistical analysis in my mind, and I decided I was okay with that level of risk. I decided, okay, if I eat right and exercise, I'll be around for another 50 years, and so I believe my house will be above water in all events while I'm still living. I believe that it will be. Listen,
all right. I hope the odds are in your favor then. Yeah. I remember going. Long is it? Highway 90, right?
Yes.
If my memory serves me, that's right on the coast there. I remember driving over there from Mobile and just looking, it was a